Gospel according to Mark. And let's jump right in and talk about authorship there. Without looking up those references, what can you tell me about Mark, assuming he wrote this Gospel? What can you tell me about this guy named Mark? Christy? Probably a Gentile. What leads you to that conclusion? Okay. Maybe it's written to Gentiles. Okay, but that's a good question. What's Mark's ethnicity? Is he Jewish or Gentile? Do we know? We'll put that one on hold. What else do we know about Mark? Ethan? Shortest of the four. Okay. Anything else? Yes. What's your name again? Zach. Okay. He wasn't one of the 12. He wasn't an eyewitness himself that we know of, although maybe he was, but we know he wasn't a disciple. And according to tradition, he's connected with Peter. Okay, what else do we know? What's your name again? Josh. I'm so bad with names. Sorry, Josh. Go ahead. Yes. He left Paul on the first missionary journey. Is that the end of the story? What else happens? Paul wanted him back. Good. Okay. The first encounter or mention we have of Mark is here in Acts 12:12. And this, you remember this context here. The people are praying the Christians are praying in a house. And what are they praying for? Do you remember Acts 12? You'll know this better when we get to Acts. But what are they praying for in this house? They're in this prayer meeting. Do you remember? Peter's release. And what happens? Peter gets released. He goes to this house. He knocks on the door. And what happens? There's this girl who answers the door, and it's Peter. She's so shocked, she goes back and tells everybody, "Hey, Peter's at the door." And they say, "You're crazy. Peter can't be at the door. We're praying that he be released, so he can't be here." A little commentary on the little lack of faith there, but there it was. And what house were they in praying? They were actually in Mark's mother's house, which might suggest, Christy, that since this house is in Jerusalem, that maybe Mark was actually Jewish. That might be one hint that he was Jewish. Okay, then we come to Acts 12:25 and also 13:13. Mark is taken along on the first missionary journey. Now, for him to be taken along on the first missionary journey with Paul and Barnabas, he must have shown some promise, or there must have been some reason that they would take him along for this important mission. But partway through, Mark bails out, and that's the 13:13 reference. He bails out, he returns to Jerusalem. This eventually leads actually to a conflict between Paul and Barnabas over Mark. And let's look at the text, actually. Acts 15:36 through 40. It's very, very interesting development here. And after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are." So they're about to go on the second missionary journey. Now Barnabas wanted to take with them John, called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose a sharp disagreement, so that they separated from each other. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. What do you make of that account? Paul and Barnabas had, notice it says they had a sharp disagreement. How do you understand that? Here about to go on another missionary journey, and these two guys disagree. Was that sinful? Was that sinful? Do you think? Probably not. I mean, maybe they had some sinful thoughts about each other in a moment, but I don't think it was a bad thing. It was a difference of opinion in terms of a certain individual, but what's the result of it? What's the result? What's the outcome of this disagreement? Right, they cover more ground. Right? So Paul takes Silas and they go one way, and Barnabas and Mark go another way, and so God can use these things for good, and certainly that happened. By the way, why was Barnabas particularly interested in Mark? Yes, we learn from Colossians 4:10 that Mark is actually Barnabas' cousin. It's also in Barnabas' nature. What's Barnabas' reputation? He's an encourager, right? And so he takes along his cousin, even though he had let them down. Mark had let them down. And then thankfully, we see in Colossians 4:10 and Philemon 24 that during Paul's first imprisonment, which Colossians and Philemon, that's when they're written, during Paul's first Roman imprisonment, Mark is actually with Paul. And so obviously a reconciliation has taken place, and that's a wonderful ending. In fact, in 2 Timothy 4:11, during his second imprisonment, Paul says, and this, by the way, is just shortly before Paul's going to be executed, and yet he says, "Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service." So that's a great story, how even though we can, fail in our service to the Lord, it's not the end of the story. That's true with Peter as well. You remember Peter denied the Lord, and yet he had a very, very important role in serving Christ. So be encouraged if you've ever messed up. Remember Mark, that he had a second chance. And remember, if you're working with others, remember this account. Paul was large-hearted, and he gave Mark a second chance. One other interesting little reference to Mark is in 1 Peter 5:13, where Peter calls Mark my son. And Peter is writing from Rome, and Mark is obviously with him in Rome. So this supports the early church tradition, that is, early Christian writers outside of the New Testament. A number of them make reference to this connection between Mark and Peter in Rome. And 1 Peter 5:13 seems to verify that tradition. In fact, that is why Mark has no real problem being accepted into the canon, even though, as it was pointed out, he's not one of the 12. He's not an apostle, but because he had such a close connection with Peter, he was basically viewed as Peter's disciple or associate, and he recorded what Peter said, and therefore Mark is considered apostolic because of the connection with Peter. Now, some have suggested that there might just be an anonymous signature in the Gospel of Mark. You remember we saw with Matthew, what was Matthew's possible signature? Yeah, the reference to him being a tax collector. It's only found in Matthew, in the list of the disciples, and also his inclusion of the story about Jesus and the temple tax. Is there any kind of similar signature in Mark? Why in the world is that included? You remember that story, Mark 14:50, 52? This reference, by the way, only occurs in Mark, and so some say, well, why include that? Well, that's Mark saying, I actually was there. It's impossible to be sure about that, and one commentator says, the identity of this naked fugitive has been clothed in much speculation. It might be simply that this young man, because it's in the context. Actually, if you look at verse 50, verse 50 says, "And they all left him and fled." And then you have this story of this young man who followed him, but when they caught him, he tried to run away too. So it might be just sort of representing that everyone left him, and they ran away in desperation, even if it meant losing their clothes. That's how desperate they were to get away. Maybe that's all the point of it is. But who knows? Maybe Mark was that young man. Okay, what about date? Which gospel do most scholars believe was written first, from our discussion a couple days ago or a couple sessions ago? Mark, right? And so Mark is probably the earliest of the gospels, canonical gospels. And it does appear that Luke used it, which is going to be significant in us trying to put together the date of Mark. Remember, I mentioned last time, the reason we even look at these questions is not because they're all that important, questions of date, but it's kind of a neat way to think through different elements of the New Testament. So, again, it's difficult to know exactly when Mark wrote this gospel. There are a couple of elements that we need to put together. First of all, Mark was with Barnabas, we just saw that, at the time of the second missionary journey, which probably is approximately 49 through 52. Okay, that's a rough time frame. The next time we hear of Mark, really, at least his location, other than there's a couple of times, right? There's the references in Colossians and Philemon, and where is he there? Where's Mark? He is with Paul. Where's Paul? In Rome. Also, this reference in 1 Peter 5:13, he's in Rome. Peter seems fairly clearly to indicate that he's in Rome. Okay, so we know Mark is in Rome. We're not sure exactly the time frame. We know that Paul's imprisonment in Rome was in the early 60s. Okay, so yeah, can we put anything else together from that information? What else can we put together from that? Anything? Okay, well, let's go back to this theory that Luke used Mark, and therefore Mark obviously comes before Luke. Well, it would seem that Luke is writing in the early 60s as well. Why would we assume that? Anything that you can put together from Luke? What other book did Luke write? Okay. How does Acts end? Do you remember how the book of Acts ends? Paul is where? He finally arrives in Rome. So that's his first Roman imprisonment. And we can date, most scholars can date that fairly accurately to the early 60s. Again, not 1960s, but 60s AD. And so we're looking at a time of about 62 for the end of Acts. So most people feel that the story sort of ends abruptly. It's almost as if that's how far Luke takes us, because that's when he's writing. So putting a little bit of deduction together. If Acts is written about AD 62, the Gospel was probably written just a little bit before that, the Gospel of Luke, 61, 62, which would mean that Mark would have to come before that time and have enough time to circulate so that Luke was aware of it, which would give us approximate date of mid to late 50s for Mark to be written. And there is early church testimony that Peter was in Rome in the 50s. So that would fit also with what we have put together. That also addresses really the target audience, because early church tradition, we see Peter in Rome, we see Mark in Rome with Peter and with Paul, and so early church tradition says that Mark was written for Gentile Christians in Rome. The Gentiles, maybe in general, some would argue there's evidence in Mark's gospel that he was writing to Gentile Christians, but I'm sure he wasn't restricting only Christians can read this gospel. So just Gentiles in Rome. This seems to be confirmed by a number of things that we see in the gospel. I think I can't remember if the textbook referred to this or not. It's a good thing we didn't have a quiz today. Do you remember, did the textbook mention any hints within the Gospel of Mark that might indicate he was writing to Gentiles in Rome? Brian? Okay, good. Jewish customs are explained. We looked at this text in connection with Matthew last time, Mark 7, 3 and 4. In Matthew, he doesn't explain Jewish customs, and therefore one conclusion, or you might conclude Matthew was writing to Jewish audience, whereas Mark has to explain certain things. So that assumes maybe a Gentile readership primarily. Anything else? Andrew? Hey, you guys are good. Aramaic words are translated. So he gives, for example, let's read 5:41. It says, taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. So he gives the Aramaic transliteration into Greek, and then he translates it for his Gentile readers. Another one that I don't think is quite as strong, but some people have put forward as another indication that he was writing to Romans or Gentiles, or writing from Rome to Gentiles, is the suggestion that the Romans are presented in more of a neutral light. For example, they offer Jesus something to drink on the cross, or even a favorable light. For example, 1539. What's 1539? What Roman centurion does something really good? Yeah, he declares Jesus to have been the Son of God. So, yeah, take that one for what it's worth. You still have Roman soldiers being brutal to Jesus as well, so that's why I'm not as convinced with that one. Okay, purpose. Before I give you the purpose statement for the Gospel of Mark, I want to show you how I came to it, and that's why I included a lot of details here on your handout. Not unlike Matthew, Mark, in this very first verse, gives us sort of his intention for writing. Mark 1:1 says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so he's basically saying, hey, this is an account of Jesus Christ, who's the Son of God. And that idea, the identity of Jesus Christ, as I put on your handout here, is a key issue throughout Mark. And the identity of Jesus as the Son of God is a central motif, or central to Mark's explanation of who Jesus is. And I've given you a number of examples of that on your handout. So, for example, the opening pronouncement, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The Son of God. So right off the bat, from the very first verse, Mark's telling us who Jesus is. He's the Son of God. And he's going to demonstrate that throughout his gospel. And then, sort of in a climactic kind of statement in 1539, you have a Roman centurion acknowledging at the cross that surely this man was the Son of God, which is a remarkable statement for a Roman centurion to make. But that was the force of even Jesus' death. It had that impact on this man. Okay, another indication of Mark presenting Jesus as the Son of God. You have the Father twice opening the heavens and declaring, "This is my beloved Son." You have demons on several occasions recognize and identify Jesus as the Son of God, which is another remarkable thing. His words demonstrate him as someone unique. Look at chapter 1, verse 22, for example. Well, 21 for context, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. Verse 22, and they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. So this teacher is of a totally different character than anything they have ever heard. He does what only God can do. For example, turn over the page, chapter 2, verse 7. You remember he heals this man, but before he actually heals him, what does he do? He pronounces what? Sins are forgiven, and the scribes were there in verse 7. Why does this man speak like that? He is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Jesus essentially says, exactly. Exactly. That's who I am. Also, the calming of the storm. We'll come back to that account a little later. One of the things that I find amazing is that people are continually amazed at Jesus. Now, why I find it amazing is because look at all those references on your handout there. Again and again and again, the reaction to Jesus is astonishment, amazement. Like he blows people away. They don't have categories for this. That's because Jesus is a unique person. He is the Son of God. Yet, there is also something surprising about this Son of God. He is the one who suffers and dies. And so there is a focus on Jesus' death. There is sort of a redefinition in Mark on what the Messiah, not only who the Messiah is, but what he does. And this is countering the expectations, the popular messianic expectations of the time. Remember, people were longing for a political leader like a Judas Maccabees. And so Mark is showing this Messiah, this Son of God, has come to die. He's come to suffer in our place. And so after Peter's great confession of Christ in 8:29, chapter 8, verse 29, Jesus begins to focus on his death. And so chapters 1 through 8 sort of prepares us for Peter's great confession, and then just, you are the Christ. the Son of God. And then after that, this Son of God has to be understood in a different way than what they might expect. He has to be understood as one who dies, who suffers for their sake. And so the rest of Mark is taken up really with that theme. And so along the way, not only does Jesus have to clarify the nature of the Son of God and the Messiah and his role, he has to clarify the nature of true discipleship. Because they think, what do they think? They have false expectations in regard to the Messiah. They also have false expectations of what it means to follow the Messiah, to be a follower of the Messiah. And so Jesus has to clarify that. And it's very interesting. There's sort of a pattern we see in Mark. Before we look at this chart specifically, though, it's interesting that the disciples in Mark are often presented in kind of a negative light. They don't understand Jesus' teaching many times. They lack faith. They're fearful. Their hearts are hardened. A couple of occasions it actually says their hearts were hardened. Chapter 6, verse 52, for example. But especially prominent is their failure to understand what Jesus is talking about when he instructs them about his death. They just don't get it. And so Jesus has to clarify that, but he also along the way has to correct their misconceptions about what it means for them to be a follower of this Son of God, this Messiah. And let's look at a couple of these references. Look at, first of all, notice the chart. Jesus predicts his death in all three of these texts, 8, 9, and 10. The disciples misunderstand, 8, 9, and 10. And then Jesus takes the opportunity to teach about the cost of discipleship or the nature of true discipleship. So look first of all at chapter 8:34. This is right after Peter's great confession. You are the Christ. Verse 31, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected, etc. Then verse 34, and calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. And again, it's almost as if the disciples are thinking, this is not what we were expecting. We were expecting the Christ to come in with great glory and deliver us politically and set up his kingdom. And now he's talking about he's going to the cross. And now he's saying that we have to take up our cross. That's not what we were thinking. Turn over to the account in chapter 9. Same pattern. Jesus predicts his death. The disciples misunderstand. And then you have this discussion in verses 33 and following. Again, it shows the disciples in a negative light. It says, and they came to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent. You can kind of see they're looking down. Their faces are turning a little red. For they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. Again, their thinking is really wrong. They're thinking about who gets the first place, who's the greatest. So he sat down and called the 12 and said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives not me, but the one who sent me. So again, a redefining of what it means to be a disciple. Chapter 10, same thing. Jesus predicts his death. The disciples misunderstand. And Jesus has to correct their thinking about discipleship. And just jump in there at verse 40. They ask, verse 37, they said to him, "Grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left hand, or left, in your glory." So again, they're still thinking of their own prominence. And so Jesus has to correct them and says, verse 33, "But it shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all." Okay, so putting all those elements together, we come up with a purpose statement for Mark. And that is, Mark's purpose is to set forth Jesus as the Son of God. We've seen that emphasis. Who suffers for our salvation. See that emphasis. And also calls us to true discipleship. A key text, perhaps, for this theme would be Mark 10:45. "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." And thus modeling what a disciple should do as well. Serve others. Okay, just a brief word about structure. Again, if you want an outline, you can get one in your textbook. But there is a pattern. We've mentioned it. You basically have the first part of the book, Jesus' ministry in Galilee. And then after Peter's great confession, you have this transition. You have this journey to Jerusalem. And there is the anticipation of Jesus' death and resurrection. And then that actually takes place in the last chapters of Mark. It's interesting, as we saw, on this journey to Jerusalem, Jesus predicts his death and resurrection 3 times. Just a comment about the literary quality of Mark, or aspects of Mark. The pace of Mark moves along very quickly. What's one of Mark's favorite words? Immediately. Immediately, this happens. In fact, this term "immediately" is used the most in Mark's gospel, over 40 times. So the scenes shift rapidly, and Jesus is presented as a man of action. Okay, what we want to do now is just look at some examples of how we read the Gospel of Mark. And there are some subtleties in the ways that Mark arranges his material that are pretty cool, but you have to be looking for them. You have to be paying attention. Usually the stories are not just a mere random throwing together of different accounts of Christ. There's some purpose behind the arrangement of his material, and I want to illustrate that. One thing that some commentators have pointed out is something they call, you'll like this technical term, the sandwich technique. The sandwich technique. And basically, what is the sandwich technique? Well, it's inserting one story in the middle of another story to make some point. Let's look at an example in Mark chapter 8. So turn to Mark chapter 8. And just We'll just read parts of this account. First of all, starting in verse 14, now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, Mark 8:15, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. Notice what Jesus says here, verse 17. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember? And then there is the account of his feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. Okay, and then we have this account starting verse 22, the healing of the blind man. And they came to Bethsaida, and the people brought him to a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see men, but they look like trees walking. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him home, saying, do not even enter the village. Okay, and then we have Peter's great confession of Christ in 27 through 30. Okay, so what we have, the first section, the disciples don't understand, healing of the blind man, and then the confession of Christ. What do you think the connection is? Well, first of all, why does Jesus heal this man in stages? Is it that he kind of didn't quite get it the first time? His power was a little bit power shortage there, and so the guy just sort of partially sees, and then he has to complete the job a little later. What's going on with that? Any guesses? In light of the context, what comes before and what comes after. Exactly right. Okay, it seems that Jesus healing this man in stages is really an object lesson for the disciples of where the disciples are at in some ways. They don't understand really, right? They're talking on one level. And so Jesus says to them, notice what he said in verse 18, having eyes, do you not see? In some ways, the disciples are still blind. They don't see clearly. All right? And then, eventually, Peter makes this great confession of Christ, and they see who he is more clearly. So Jesus heals the man in stages as an illustration of the disciples' grasp of Jesus as the Messiah. They're not totally clear, and then they have this revelation of who Jesus is, and they see more clearly. But even then, they don't get Jesus' role. He has to explain to them, I'm going to die, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to be raised again. So that's an example. Another example, let's look at Mark 5, 21 through 43. What you have in this account is you have Jairus coming to Jesus asking that Jesus heal his daughter. And then you have the story interrupted a little bit by this woman who has been sick for 12 years with this flow of blood, and no one can heal her. And she touches Jesus, and she's healed. And then it returns to the account with Jairus. Okay, let's actually read this account. And what I want you to do is just pay really close attention to the connections between these two stories. Okay, pretend we're back in CLBS and you're in the observation stage. Okay, remember that? Okay, so pay attention to all the details and any connections that might link these two stories. All right? Verse 21, chapter 5. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. And he went with them. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, If I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, Who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, Who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, be healed of your disease. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, Do not fear, only believe. He allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother, and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which means, Little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that they should tell that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Okay, compare and contrast. Is there any significance that you see between these two stories beyond the mere chronology of events? The way Mark reports it, do you see any? What do you see? Just anything. Brainstorm here. Any connections that you might see? Okay, that's an interesting point. The woman was sick for 12 years, and Mark in verse 42 puts in that the little girl was 12 years of age. So there's maybe a link between the two. Anything else? Yeah, okay, so in both situations, really, it's hopeless. It seems hopeless. The woman, she's tried everything, and nothing has worked. And death, it seems hopeless. The people say, don't bother the teacher anymore. Okay, good. Liz? Okay, at the end there. Good. What else? Ben? Okay, so they come to Jesus in a similar way. They both fall on their feet before him. Caitlin? Interesting, the connection there. Did you see that verse 34? And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. And then verse 35, some from the ruler's house said, "Your daughter is dead." But Jesus says to him, verse 36, "Do not fear, only believe." So daughter, daughter, faith, faith. Yeah. Anything else you notice? Some other elements we could focus on, but those hit some of the highlights. There's fear in both cases, right? Verse 33, the woman comes, fear, trembling. Verse 36, do not fear. It's interesting as well that Jairus is named, but what's the name of the woman? Her name's not given, right? So that's a point of contrast. Here is Jairus, a person of authority, wealth, prominence. He can invite Jesus to his home. The woman, we don't know anything about that. She seems to be poor, right? She spent all her resources on trying to get well. We don't know her name. She has to sneak up on Jesus. So Jairus is a person of privilege, prominence. This is a poor woman. But in the one thing that matters, this guy has no advantage over the woman at all, does he? In fact, Jairus needs to learn something from this poor woman. That is, believe in Jesus. So Jesus says, don't be afraid, just believe. What kind of faith should this guy have? He should have the same kind of faith that the other daughter of Jesus, the daughter of Jesus has. A kind of faith that believes in Jesus even in impossible situations. So the woman exemplifies and defines faith for Jairus, and teaches Jairus what it means to trust. So it's good to when you're reading through these stories and accounts, try to see connections, compare, contrast, and the story becomes more alive as you see these little details, these little elements. Now, before we leave that, we might ask the question, okay, we've seen some connection in these accounts. Is there any connection with what has come before? And that's where I list for you these three accounts. So turn back, first of all, to chapter 4. We've read the last account, 5:21 through 43, but let's go back to 4:35 through 41. On that day, verse 35, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And the other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Okay, notice some key questions that Jesus asks. Verse 40, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And then the disciples' question, "Who then is this?" Who then is this? That seems to be a key question. Those seem to be key questions. Now, you go on to the next account. We won't take the time to read it, but it is 5:1 through 20, the account of Jesus healing the man with this legion of demons. You remember, he cast it out, and the demons go into the pigs and over the cliff and into the sea. But this is an intense kind of situation. You read the early description, the early verses, the description of the way this possessed man is being manipulated by the demons. Verse 4, notice the last sentence. No one had the strength to subdue him. Okay? And then Jesus comes along and makes the difference. And then we read the last account. So, my question is there any connection in each of these accounts? Well, yes. Notice in each of these stories, this is on your outline here, in each of these stories, people find hope in Jesus when all human hopes are exhausted. Right? That's true in the storm. Humans don't have any control over the weather. A storm like that. And in the account of Jesus healing the man with the legion of demons, I pointed out verse 4 for you. No one had the strength to subdue him. This was beyond human ability. And of course, in the two accounts with Jairus and the woman, remember, the woman exhausted all her resources. And Jairus' daughter died. Surely these human hopes are exhausted in all these situations, but all of them are able to find hope in Jesus. In each of these stories, we see fear. We see fear with the disciples in the boat. They fear for their lives because of this great storm. We see in the account with the demon, the people see what Jesus had done, and they are afraid. This is wow, more than they can handle. We see fear in the woman who was healed from the discharge of blood. She was fearful when she was found out. We see fear, Jesus telling Jairus, don't be afraid. And in each of these accounts we see faith. Jesus says to the disciples, have you still no faith? We see with the demon-possessed man who was healed, he wanted to follow Jesus. He believed in Jesus now, and he went out and told everyone about Jesus. How is the woman healed? Faith. What does Jesus tell Jairus? Believe. Okay, so what can we conclude? Well, who then is this? Who then is this? That's the key question. And there's a connection, I think, in all these three stories that demonstrates something about Jesus. Who then is this? Well, he is the one who has power over the natural realm. Like no one else anybody has ever seen, Jesus has power over the natural realm. And this is a very important story because I point out on your handout there doesn't just demonstrate Jesus' power over nature. Its ultimate purpose is to show that Jesus does what only God can do. And I've given you 3 references in the Psalms there. We won't take the time to look them up. Actually, let's look up one. This is very important. Turn to Psalm 107. I want you to see this for yourself. Psalm 107. Verses 23 through 29. Wow, did you see verse 29 there? He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Who did that? Who did that in this psalm? What does it say? Verse 24. The Lord. Does your version have Lord in capital letters? What does that mean? Yahweh. Yahweh is the one who makes the storm be still and the waves of the sea were hushed. You have to understand that background to understand the significance of of what Jesus is doing here. He does what only Yahweh can do. He's the Son of God. And you see two more references in the Psalms that say essentially the same thing, that only God can calm the storm. The bottom of page 3 there on your handout, Jesus does what only God can do. That's the conclusion we want to make from this. And remember chapter 2, verse 7, the scribes object, "Why does this man speak like this? He is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" So Jesus is doing what only God can do. And Mark wants us to see that. Mark wants us to feel the impact of that as he puts his material together. Okay, so in the first account, chapter 4, he has power over the natural realm. Over the page now. The next account, he heals the demon-possessed man, demonstrating he has power over the spiritual realm. And it's significant in that account, in Mark chapter 5, verse 4, that Mark feels it important to add, no one had the strength to subdue him. No one but Jesus. And then in the accounts that we read with Jairus and then the woman with the discharge of blood, Jesus demonstrates he has power over the physical realm. And again, remember, Mark highlights the fact that no one could help this woman. She tried for 12 years. No one could help her. Death. Jesus even raises a person from the dead. So what's the conclusion then? You got to conclude that Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is the one who has the power and authority that only God has. He's the one that should be feared, but he says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Trust in me. Trust in me. Believe in me. Even in the most desperate circumstances that you can imagine, natural realm, spiritual realm, physical realm, trust me. Trust me. That's kind of cool, huh? Look at, when you read through the Gospels, look for those kinds of things. A lot of these stories are familiar to us, but I think a lot of times we don't slow down and take the time and meditate and see some of these connections. And the Gospels become much more exciting to us when we take the time to look at these things and employ your observation skills and think through the significance. Okay, one more thing we need to address, and that is the question of the ending of the Gospel, the ending of Mark. There's a lot of detail on this, so I just included some information there on your handout so you wouldn't have to try and write it down, but follow along here. Look, actually, first of all, turn to the end of Mark's Gospel, chapter 16, and notice verse 8. This is the account of the resurrection, chapter 16, 1 through 8. And verse 8 says this, "And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." And then in your Bible, does it have something like, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include verses 9 through 20? Most Bibles have some indication that verses 9 through 20, there's some question about whether Mark actually wrote those. So look at your handout. There is a question about what is the true ending of Mark. Most scholars today believe that Mark ends at verse 8 and that verses 9 through 20 were later added by someone else. Now, why do people think that? There are several strong arguments against including this longer ending of verses 9 through 20. Let me give you some examples. There are more, but here's some highlights. it's missing from some of the most reliable and early manuscripts. They don't have verses 9 through 20. They end with verse 8. Two important early Christian writers, Eusebius and Jerome, both state that the best manuscripts available to them did not contain this longer ending. This is especially significant for Jerome. Do you know anything about this guy Jerome? Ryan? Yes, he was the one who was responsible for translating the Bible into Latin, and it's called the Latin Vulgate, which became the authorized version of the church in the West. And Jerome was a real scholar. He went through a lot of effort to get manuscripts together and everything that was available to him to make this authorized translation. He went to great lengths to find. And so the fact that Jerome says the best manuscripts available to him don't contain those verses is a significant point. Bullet 3, two other endings exist, a shorter one and this longer one with yet another addition, which suggests that scribes felt the need to give Mark a proper ending. Verse 8 seems to end so abruptly. It's like, oh, you're leaving us hanging. You're going to end there? And so others feel they need to tell the rest of the story. Maybe the author was Paul Harvey. I don't know. And then the fourth bullet there, the longer ending does not flow naturally after 6:18 or 6:8. If you look at it, there's the ending. They were afraid. They said nothing. And then the way 9 flows, it doesn't quite fit with Mark's narrative, is the argument. And 9 through 20 contains some words, expressions, style that seems opposite of the way Mark writes. Okay. But that raises a question. Does it really make sense for Mark to end his gospel at verse 8? Look at verse 8 again. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Does it make sense for it to end that way? Well, yes, because Mark does not typically add a whole lot of editorial comment. He lets the story speak for itself. So he ends it abruptly. He ends it with Jesus risen and his followers blown away by this. They're in amazement. Which, if you look back to page 2, and the last bullet point under A, people are continually amazed at Jesus. I gave you all those references. They're amazed again and again and again. And so that's a good way for Mark to end his gospel. They're amazed. Jesus is risen. He's blown them away yet again. Now, last point there. It's important to emphasize that this is not an issue of inspiration. Okay? It's only whether or not someone added something to Mark's gospel. So it's not like, okay, don't lose your faith if someone tells you verses 9 through 20 probably weren't original with Mark. Okay, it's just, don't fall into a crisis of faith. It's not at that level. And even if you look at verses 9 through 20, there's really no significant point of doctrine affected, and actually most of the content is found elsewhere in the New Testament. So it's not like someone slipped in some Gnosticism into Mark's gospel.